Welcome to LiveDaf, your online Daf Yomi Shiur.
Shalom and welcome back to today's Daf Yomi Shabbos Daf Tzadik Tes. We're right on top of the Amid. Says the Gemara, Tana Rabbanan, we learned on a brayso. Yeriyos hatachtonos, the lower covering over the Mishkan. The Mishkan had two coverings. So we're speaking about the lower one, and the brayso calls them Yeriyos hatachtonos, a plural term, because we learned on the Daf Tzadik Tes that the coverings over the Mishkan consisted of many parts which were sewn together, which were hooked together. So the first covering, that's the Yeriyos hatachtonos, consisted of shel tchelas, blue wool, v'shel argaman, purple wool, v'shel ashani, red wool, v'shel sheish, and some linen mixed in as well. And it also contained some embroidered images, which were embroidered into the material. So this describes the lower covering. Ve'el yoinos, now the upper covering, shel masa izim, it was made of goat's hair. Now, although perhaps the lower covering was prettier than the upper covering, says the brayso, ugedola chachma, shenemar be'el yoinos, the wisdom, the expertise used to describe the making of the upper covering is actually greater. Yoiser mima shenemar tachtonos, more than used to describe the lower covering. Why? When it comes to the low covering, it says, "V'chol isha chachmas leiv yedei atavu," an isha who was a chachmas leiv, a wise-hearted woman, b'yedei atavu. So they would spin, they would fashion those curtains. However, when it comes to the upper ones, it says, all the women who their hearts carried them with chachma, were inspired, they spun the goats. So what was so special? Why did it require such a high level of expertise? Continues the Gemara, V'tanya, Mishur Nechemya, Shatav Be'izim. So the hair was actually washed on the goats themselves. V'tovim in izim, and spun from the goats themselves on the goats. So this required an added measure of chachma, of wisdom and expertise. Now, what was so unique about this? Why was this done in this manner? It says the Masha, because they wanted to avoid tumah. So when something is connected to a Baal Chai, living creature, it's immune from being Mekabel Tumah, from contracting Tumah. So they avoided Tumah, that's why it was preferred to do it in this manner. And indeed, that took a greater measure of Chachma and expertise. Continues the Gemara, Shtegezus Strois. Amar Rav, Mishur Rabechia. Agolis, you meant to know that the Agolis, these wagons, which were used to transport the Krashim, Tachteim, beneath them, Ubeineim, in between them, Vitzideim, alongside their sides, this is the wheel area. Rishus Harabim, it had a din of Rishus Harabim. So if one transfers an object at a distance of 4 amas in that area, he is chayiv. As we learned yesterday, we're speaking specifically about those areas which were uncovered and unroofed and exposed to the open air. Amrabai, ben Agola la Agola, kimloi Orach Agola. We know the wagons would travel side by side. So the two wagons which traveled alongside each other, says Abai, in between them there was a space which equaled the same distance of the length, the Orach of the Agola itself. How much is that? V'kama Orach Agola, hey amas. The Agola was 5 amas long, and that is the amount that was needed as a space between the two Agolas which traveled side by side. Why did they need that space? Very simple, because they put the Krashim over the Agolis, and the Krashim were very long, they were 10 amas long, so they would hang over the narrow wagons, which were merely, the Gemara is going to say they were merely 2.5 amas wide. So the Keresh would hang over it, would lean over it. So we had 2 Krashim, which were situated head to head, going on these 2 Agolis. So you need that extra space in between the Agolis to accommodate for everything. Okay, says the Gemara, 1 second. Why did the wagon need to be 5 amas long? Lamali, why did it need to be that long? Bedald upal gasagi. It appears to be that it would be sufficient with merely 4.5 length. Why? Says Rashi, because either way you'd stack the Krashim, you would have sufficient with merely 4.5. Let's say you would stack them 3 stacks side by side. So now the Keresh, 10 amas long, 1.5 amas wide, and it was an amma thick. So if you take 3 stacks and stack them on their width. So it's 1.5 times 3, it equals 4.5. Or alternatively, if you would stack them on their narrow sides, you would make 4 stacks. You can't have more than that. Rashi says they had rings protruding from the krushim, so you need to have some space in between them. So at the most you would have is 4 stacks, each one taking up an amma. So there again, 4.5 certainly would accommodate all those stacks. So why did you need 5? Says the Gemara, why? So that these heavy beams, these heavy boards, wouldn't bump into each other. Taisa says they were heavy, they would move around. So you need some leeway, some extra space to allow for that as well. Continues the Gemara, Amarav, Sidei Agola, these sides of the Agola. Rashi explains the areas of the wheel area and the actual width of the frame of the width of the Agola. So that equaled, how wide was that area? That equaled the same as the width of the wagon itself. How much is that? So the width of the wagon was 2.5. Now tzideim, the tzidei agola, the wheel area on both sides, the actual width of the thickness of the frame on both sides, equaled another 2.5 amma, leaving us with a total of 5 ammas, which was the roichav of the entire agola. So basically the agola was 5 ammas long and 5 ammas wide, at least at the widest point where the wheels were. Says the Gemara, but why do you need such a wide wagon? Why does the frame need to be 2.5 ammas wide? Lomali, ba'amso palgasagya. Perhaps 1.5 should be sufficient. How do we get to 1.5? Says Rashi, because let's say decides to place the keresh not over the width of the agola, but rather alongside the length of the agola. So we'll take the keresh, which has a thickness of 1 amma. The narrow side is 1 amma. So he places on that 1 amma, and it's alongside the length of the agola, which will be, let's say, 1.5 ammas wide, which can adequately accommodate this keresh. So why does the agola need to be so wide? Says the Gemara, you know why? So that the krushim shouldn't tip over. So they shouldn't bounce around, tip over. So we needed a more stable surface for that. Therefore, you need to have at least a 2.5 amma wide frame to allow for the keresh, which was stacked over the width of this agola. So it provided a stable base for the keresh that doesn't totter, it doesn't tip over. Okay, continues the Gemara. Let's make a quick calculation. We have these 2 wagons which are traveling side by side. What are the sizes of these wagons? So we spoke about the width of each wagon being 5. So we have 5 from one wagon, 5 from the other wagon, and Abaye told us in between there was a space of 5. So this leaves us with a total of 15 ames, which was the width, the roichav of this whole procession. Says the Gemara, Ela de Kaimela. Now, the fact that we do know as an established fact, Derech Rishis Rabim, Sheshisrei Amma, that a public thoroughfare is meant to be at least 16 amas wide. So when it comes, let's say, to Shabbos, the din of Rishis Rabim is only if it is at least 16 amas wide. Where do we get that from? Where do we get the number 16? Anan, the Gamari Lomi Mishkan, that we learn it from Mishkan, just as we learn all the halachas of Shabbos from the Mishkan. The Mishkan Chamesh Rihavi. Here we merely have 15. Says the Gemara, Amsi Yisei Ravai. There was actually another Amma. What for? To have a Koi Ben Levi, because the Levi who was following the Agola, he needed to run into that Amma. Meaning they would leave an extra space on both sides of the Agola. So we have the 2 wagons traveling side by side. They left a sort of a shoulder on each side, an extra half amma space on each side of the 2 agolas to allow the Ben Levi, who was walking behind the agola, to run in there and to tend to the krushim, which were falling out of line. The Ben Levi would stand at the chimishtalfi krushim. If the krushim would slip around, have a knocket loose, he would run into the side and straighten them out and align them properly. So this gives us a total of 16 amos wide for the Rishis Rabim in the midbar. So a quick summary, we learned that the derech Yisrael is meant to be 16 amma. How do we get to 16? We have 2 agolis, each one is 5 ammas wide. Between them is another 5 ammas. And we have the additional amma needed for the Levi to come tend to the Krushim who are slipping out of line. Continues the Mishnah. Chulias haboir v'asela shein gvoyin asora v'rochvan abba. Let's say a person has a chulias habar. So a bar is a pit, a cistern, and we have the chulias habar, which was the embankment, the rim around the bar, or hasela, which was a rock, a stone, shein gvoyin asora, which are 10 tefachim high, above ground, v'rochvan abba, and they have a surface on top of 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim. This is considered to be a Rishus HaYachid. So we know there are 2 forms of Rishus HaYachid, whether above ground, elevated, 10 tefachim above the ground, or 10 tefachim below. For instance, a bar, which would be 10 tefachim below ground, that is considered to be a Rishus HaYachid. Says the Mishnah, so if these surfaces do fit the criterion of Rishus HaYachid, they are 10 tefachim high and 4 tefachim wide. Hanoitumen. So if one takes from these surfaces, he's standing in Rishus HaRabbi, and he takes an object off this sela, which is 10 by 4, or he places something on the Rishus HaYachid, chayav, because when he removes something, he's removing from the Rishus HaYachid to the Rishus HaRabbi, or anoisna gabon, he's taking something from where he's standing in Rishus HaRabbi and placing on Rishus HaYachid. Pachas mekan, but if they don't fit these dimensions, they're not considered to be a Rishus HaYachid, and he is potter. Says the Gemara, why does the Mishnah begin by describing a chulia sabar? What purpose? The Mishnah apparently is trying to teach us that there are 2 examples, 2 forms of Rishus HaYachid, either above ground or below ground. Either an elevated Rishus HaYachid, which is 10 tefachim high, or a Rishus HaYachid, which is below ground, for instance, a bar, which is 10 tefachim deep. So, the fact that the Mishnah discusses a sela, that addresses the elevated Rishus HaYachid. The fact that the Mishnah mentions a bar, that is referencing the Rishus HaYachid, which is below ground level. But why discuss the chulias habar? What purpose is there in discussing, making mention of this embankment around the bar, which is merely another form of an elevated Rishus HaYachid, which is already covered with the word sela, which is also an elevated Rishus HaYachid? Let's take a look at the Gemara. Lamali lemisni chulias habar v'asela. Why go into those examples? Listen, habar v'asela. Why can't the Mishnah simply say that there are 2 examples, 2 forms of Rishus HaYachid? Number 1, a bar, which is below ground, v'asela, which is above ground, which is an elevated Rishus HaYachid. Why throw in the chulias habar? Says the Gemara, the Mishnah is alluding to something else. It's teaching us a halacha. Mesayeh le Rabbi Yochanan. It's in support of Rabbi Yochanan. Dam Rabbi Yochanan, bar v'chuliyasa mitzdarfen l'asar. Rabbi Yochanan tells us a chiddush. Let's say we have a bar, a pit which is merely 5 tefachim deep. So on its own, it's not Rishus HaYachid. But there's an additional chulia surrounding the bar, an encampment, an embankment, which is around the bar, a rim, which is surrounding the bar, which has a dimension. It's 5 tefachim elevated off the ground. Says Rav Yechon, those 2 things combine to create a Rishus HaYachid. Rashi explained the Rishus HaYachid inside that enclosure. So we combine both surfaces. We combine the depth of the bar, which is 5 tefachim. We combine the height of the chulia, which is an additional 5 tefachim, and this gives us a total combined 10 tefachim, and creates a Rishus HaYachid therein. Tosfos actually points out that even on top of the chulia would also be considered Rishus HaYachid. So this is the chiddush of Yochanan, and this is alluded in the words of the Mishnah, chulia sabar. Not only if it's a bar, a pit below ground, or a sela, which is an elevated Rishus HaYachid, even if we have a combined Rishus HaYachid below ground and above ground, they combine to the total of 10 tefachim, and it is regarded as Rishus HaYachid. Continues the Gemara, Tani Nami Hachi. We learned as well in the Brisa. Bar Rishus HaRabim amuka yud v'rechav arba. If one has a pit in Rishus HaRabim, a cistern, a well, let's say, which is 10 by 4, 10 deep, has a surface of 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, Ein memalin hemena b'Shabbos. Certainly one cannot draw from this bur. He can't draw water from the bur which is the Rishus HaYachid. He can't take out water out into the Rishus HaRabim. Elim kain, unless Ashla Mechitza Gvay Yutfachim. They partitioned of 10 tfachim high, and he will be inside that partition. Certainly in that case he can draw water from the one Rishus HaYachid to where he's standing, which is inside the Mechitza. And likewise, a person may not even lean into the bur and drink from it on Shabbos. There's a concern that perhaps he's going to take the kli back out with him into Rishus HaRabim. That's not allowed. Unless he inserts into the bur cavity his head and most of his body, in which case there's no concern of haitzah. The Brisa continues, Ubar v'chol yasa, the pit and its bank, mitzdarf l'asara can complete the share of asara, and this is in accordance with Rabbi Yechon, who tells us that we can combine both surfaces, the depth of the bur and the elevation of the chulya, to give us the grand total of 10 tfachim to form a Rishus HaYachid. So in summary, we learn from our Mishnah, we have 3 forms of Rishus HaYachid. Rishus HaYachid is meant to be 10 tfachim height by with a surface of 4 tfachim long, 4 tfachim wide. And we have 3 versions, 3 examples of the Rishus HaYachid. Either a bur, which has a depth of 10 tfachim, a sela, which has a height of 10 tfachim, and finally a bur and its chulya. So we have depth and height, can both be mitzdaref to the grand total of 10 tfachim to create a Rishus HaYachid. Continues the Gemara. Boi minei Rav Mordechai mi Rava. So he asked the following question of Rava. Amud b'Rishus HaRabim. What if there's a post in Rishus HaRabim, which is a Rishus HaYachid, because it is Gavoya Yud, 10 tfachim high, v'Rachav Daled, and it has a surface on top of 4 tfachim length, 4 tfachim width. So it's a full-fledged Rishus HaYachid. V'Zorak v'Nochal Gabav. A person is standing in Rishus HaRabim, he takes an object and throws it onto this post. It lands on this post. Mao, what is the halacha here? Miyar min, do we say, Hari Akira be'Isser? Hari Anacha be'Isser? He's certainly chayiv. Why? Because the Akira, the lifting of the object, was be'Isser, was prohibited, it was in Rishus HaRabim. Hari Anacha be'Isser? The landing, the placing of the object was also with the prohibition because it was on the Amud, which is Rishus HaYachid. So he's chayiv. Oidilma, or perhaps we should say that he's pater. Why? Oidilma kiven dimimakim pater ka'asya. This object arrived from where? From a makom tur, an exempt area. Why? As Sais explains, he threw the object up in the air into a makom tur because the Rishus HaRabim only extends up until 10 tfachim from the ground. So this object was thrown up in the air, up into this no man's land, and up there in the makom tur, it changed direction. The gravity pulled it back down over the Rishus HaYachid, and it landed on Rishus HaYachid. Perhaps we should say that his Maisa terminated. When the object reached up high, his Maisa stopped right there. The fact that it continued on and it angled back down onto the Rishus HaYachid, that's not attributed to him. That's something new. And therefore he should be pater, because this object arrived from Makom pater. It's not one continuous act of an uninterrupted akira which led to hanacha. In this case, since he threw it up in the air, up into the no man's land, past the 10 tfachim, which was not above the Rishus HaYachid yet, and then it angled back down over the Rishus HaYachid and landed on the Rishus HaYachid, he should be pater. Let's see again. Oidilma, or perhaps, kivan dimimakim p'tur ka'asya, since the object arrived into the Rishus HaYachid from where? From above 10 tfachim of Rishus HaRabim, which is a makom p'tur, an exempt area, loy. So you can't hold him accountable or liable. Let's take a look at Rashi inside. Rashi here is 5 lines from the top, beginning with the words Hari Akir be'Isser. So once again, he throws an object from Rishus HaRabim, and it passed through the area which was a space which was beyond the 10 tfachim range of Rishus HaRabim. So we have 2 sides of the coin. On one hand, we say Hari Akir be'Isser, Rishus HaRabim. It was lifted from Rishus HaRabim. Hari Anacha be'Isser. the hanacha took place b'isser rishus hayachid. So he's chayiv. Or alternatively, let's exempt him because mimakim p'tur ka'asya. She efshar. Rashi says it's impossible. Shleigbi atchila l'mal min ha'amud. It can't be. It's impossible that the item has never arrived higher than 10 tefachim. Shu makom p'tur. She'enu avir rishus rabim. Because it's no longer avir rishus rabim. Rishus rabim only extends up until 10 tefachim off the ground. So in order for this object to have landed on this post, which is 10 tefachim high, it must be that first it lifted beyond 10 tefachim of rishus rabim, and only then was able to land on the post. Now Rashi is going to point out that the avir above the post itself certainly doesn't pose any concern because the rishus hayachid extends upward. We learned earlier in Masechet Shabbos, rishus hayachid oile ad l'rakia extends upward until heaven. So on the post itself, no matter how high you're going to go, is rishus hayachid. The concern is not regarding the avir of the post. The concern is strictly regarding the avir above rishus harabim, and this object passed through that avir on the way to the post. Let's see Rashi. Va'avir rishus hayachid nami lo yahavi. This air is not considered to be avir rishus hayachid. Dechi amrin rishus hayachid oile ad l'rakia. When we say that rishus hayachid, it extends up to the rakia hanamila. That's only kineg rishus hayachid. When it's opposite rishus hayachid, aval ahai. But this object, which passed through the airspace above 10 tefachim over rishus harabim, mikami delimti la'aver amud, prior to arriving to the airspace of the post, he elevated, he took it past 10 tefachim of rishus harabim. That's a makam p'tur. So perhaps he should be patur. So this was the question posed by Rav Mordechai to Rava. Is he patur or is he chayiv? Amarle. So Rava responded, Mas nisani. We have a right from our Mishnah which says that if a person places a chayfetz, an object, on the stone or on the embankment, he's chayiv. And the Gemara is assuming that this includes even throwing. So apparently there's no concern, even though the object arrived to that stone from a makam p'tur, from beyond the 10 tefachim of rishus harabim. So that was his response. Certainly he's chayiv. We ignore the fact that it traversed the makam p'tur. We connect the akira with the hanacha, and therefore he's chayiv. So he continued, Asa Shailu Rav Yosef. Rav Mordechai proceeded and he came to ask Rav Yosef the same question. Amalei mas nisni. We have a right from our Mishnah. Asa Shailu Abaye. So he came and asked Abaye, Amalei mas nisni. So all three responded in kind. We have a right from our Mishnah, he's chayiv. Amalahu, so he wasn't impressed. He says, Kulu, all of you, Kulchu b'chruka, the hadadi, ruka is a spit. Each other spit, tafisu, you've grabbed, meaning you're all saying the same thing. He wasn't impressed with this response. So Rashi elsewhere actually says that you all heard the same thing, meaning you're all parroting the same words. So Amrulay, so they all responded. They said, "What's wrong with our Haraya? Ba'atlay Tispra, do you not agree with the Raya from our Mishnah? V'atzanan, haven't we learned? Hanoitu mehen, if one removes from them, v'nois nalgama, or places on them, he's chayiv." So apparently, Gemara is assuming even throwing an object on this stone, which is elevated 10 tefachim off the ground, would incur liability, even though the item passes through the aver of makam p'tur. Amar Lewis responded, he said, you know what? I can negate your proof. Why? Perhaps our Mishnah is speaking about throwing a needle, in which case the needle doesn't take up much space, and therefore it had not traveled through a makam p'tur. It went straight onto the stone from rishus harabim. Says, well, what do you mean? A machat nami, even a needle, it can't be the limit laya purta, that it wasn't elevated somewhat. It wasn't. It didn't go up a bit beyond the 10 tefachim range of rishus harabim. It's inevitable. Even a needle, even a pin, which is very small and negligible, it still needs to pass through the makam p'tur to get to this stone, which is 10 tefachim off the ground. It's inevitable that it passed through some minute amount of avir of makam p'tur above 10 tefachim, which was above rishus harabim, in order to land on the stone, which is 10 tefachim off the ground. Says the Gemara, no. The Islam Mursha. We're speaking about a stone which has a protrusion, a ledge. So although the stone itself was 10 tefachim high, but it had a small ledge, a small protrusion sticking out, and the machat was thrown onto that ledge. So it never actually left the Rishus Rabbim. It never went above 10 tefachim. Now, Rashi points out that although the ledge here is a very small space, so why is it considered Rishus HaYachid? Says Rashi, has the din of Choyru Rishus HaYachid. This is a din we learned earlier in Masechah Shabbos that if there's a hole in a wall of Rishus HaYachid, it's considered to be an extension of Rishus HaYachid. It's the same Makam Shimush. So although it's merely a small hole, it's considered to be subordinate and part of Rishus HaYachid. So here as well, this stone, which is 10 tefachim of the ground, which has this protrusion, a small edge, that small edge is considered to be Rishus HaYachid. So he says, well, he took the needle and threw it straight onto that ledge. It never left the airspace of Rishus Rabbim. That's why it's chayiv. So you have no right from here to my question. Inami, alternatively, the Ramya Becharitza. He threw the needle into a crevice of the stone. There was a crevice. He threw it straight to the crevice, and once again, it never left the airspace of Rishus Rabbim. Continues the Gemara. Amarav Miyasha. Boy Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan asked another question. Kaisa b'Rishus Rabbim. What if there's a wall in Rishus Rabbim, Gavoya Yud, which is 10 tefachim high, ve'enei rochav arba, but it is not 4 tefachim wide. So the area, the surface on top of the wall is actually elevated 10 tefachim off Rishus Rabbim, but it's not wide enough to be considered Rishus HaYachid. It doesn't contain a space, a surface of 4 tefachim wide. Umukaf lekarmelis. Now this wall is actually close to a karmelis, which is neither Rishus HaYachid or Rishus Rabbim, and it's encasing the karmelis and turning it into Rishus HaYachid, va'asur Rishus HaYachid. This wall is actually making Rishus HaYachid within the area within it. So although it itself doesn't have the dimensions of Rishus HaYachid, but it's creating Rishus HaYachid because it's surrounding an unfenced, ungated area and rendering it Rishus HaYachid. So what happened here? V'zorak v'noch agabav. Person takes an object and throws it onto the top of this wall, on the surface of this wall, which is a narrow surface. What will be the halach in this case? Mriyam rinan, shall we say, kivin ein rochav dalet, since it doesn't have a surface of 4 tefachim wide, makam p'turu, it's an exempt area, it's not Rishus HaYachid, and therefore he's part. A dilma, or perhaps we should say, kivin the asa Rishus HaYachid, since this wall created a Rishus HaYachid in the area within it, because it fenced off this unfenced area, it created a Rishus HaYachid. Let's view the whole area, this whole enclosure within this wall, as if it's filled up, and the surface on top of the wall is merely an extension of that interior, and it also is considered to be part of Rishus HaYachid. Amar Ula. So Ula responded, Kavachomer, it's a Kavachomer, certainly. This wall needs to be viewed as Rishus HaYachid. Why? If this wall has the ability to make a mechitza for others, certainly for itself, it makes a mechitza. You only have the ability to impart to others something which you contain yourself, so to speak. So in this case as well, if he has the ability to make a mechitza for others, certainly it itself would be considered Rishus HaYachid, and therefore the surface on top of this kaisel is considered to be an extension of the interior within, and is considered to be Rishus HaYachid as well. Let's take a look at Rashi here. Rashi here is 30 lines from the bottom, beginning with the word la'achirim. It says Rashi la'achirim, kol ha'chalal also Rishus HaYachid. This wall, he influenced the entire enclosure within, this whole halal, this whole space, he made into Rishus HaYachid. La'asver la'koshkein, Rosh HaKaisel, certainly the head, the top of the wall, could be considered to be a Rishus HaYachid. Now, Tosfos points out that the Gemara's whole shiloh was merely when we have a kaisel next to a karmelis. But of course, if this kaisel, this wall, was situated next to a Rishus Rabbim, and it actually had the ability to transform a Rishus Rabbim into a Rishus HaYachid by enclosing that area, of course there would be no question here that it affects the kaisel itself, And if the kaisel has the ability to make a Rishis Rabban into a Rishis HaYachid, certainly the kaisel itself would have the halachic status of a Rishis HaYachid as well. Continues the Gemara with another Shaila, the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Boy Rabbi Yochanan. We're going to speak about a situation where two things happened at once, simultaneously. Boy Tisha, if he has a pit which is merely 9 tfachim deep, which is not yet a Rishis HaYachid, and he went ahead, v'okar mimena chulya, so he removed a layer of earth, which was a tefach thick. Now, by doing so, he completed the dimension of the bar. He created a Rishis HaYachid. V'ishlimu la'asara. By lifting this layer of earth, he deepened the bar. Right now, it is 10 tfachim deep. What will be the halach in this case? Let's analyze this. He removed the earth from a bar. At the point of the akira of lifting the earth, the bar was not yet a Rishis HaYachid. It was merely 9 tfachim deep. But as he's removing the earth, simultaneous with his removal of the earth, the bar is being fashioned into a Rishis HaYachid. It's becoming 10 tfachim deep. What's going to be the halach in this case? Do we regard it as an akira from Rishis HaYachid? And if he goes ahead and lands this earth in Rishis HaRabim, he performed a malacha v'etzah, or not? Do we say, well, the bar initially did not have a dimension of Rishis HaYachid, it was merely 9 tfachim deep. It only happened through his akira. It's too late. It's simultaneous with the akira. It's not considered to be an akira from Rishis HaYachid. Let's say we go to the Gemara. What is halach in this case? Akiras chayfetz, lifting the chayfetz, in this case the earth, v'asiyas mechitza, and fashioning the partition, making this boyer into Rishis HaYachid, ba'adei adodikasu, are happening simultaneously. U'mechayev, and therefore we should hold him accountable for it. Perhaps we should say that anything that happens simultaneously is actually viewed as a successive occurrence, as though it's happening in succession, one prior to the other. Perhaps we should say that we view it as though first comes the Rishis HaYachid and then the akira, and therefore he's chayiv. Or perhaps he's not chayiv because it happened simultaneously. There was no Rishis HaYachid there when he began his akira. Let's take a look at Rashi inside. So Rashi here is continuing from where we left off. It's actually 28 lines from the bottom. V'okar mimena chulya. So this fellow lifted a layer of earth off this bottom of the pit. V'nicha b'Rishis HaRabim, and he placed it in Rishis HaRabim. Mi mechayiv. Should he say that he's chayiv? Af hagav, although the mekame akira prior to doing the akira lav Rishis HaYachid, it was not a Rishis HaYachid, it was merely 9 tfachim deep. B'shas akira, however, during the time of akira, mia Rishis HaYachid hava is considered to be Rishis HaYachid. It's happening simultaneously. So do we view it as though it's simultaneous and therefore there was no Rishis HaYachid during the akira, or do we view it as occurrences that happen in succession? Let's say first it becomes Rishis HaYachid and then the akira. Continues the Gemara inside. Now, if you propose and say that no, he can't be held accountable here, there's no chiyuv. Since initially, when he began the akira, there was no mechitza 10 tfachim deep, he can't be chayiv. Okay, so if you say in this case he'll be pater, what about in the next case? A similar case where there was a hanocha simultaneous with affecting the mechitza status. Let's see. If he has a pit which is 10 tfachim deep, which is a proper Rishis HaYachid, and he placed a layer of dirt in this bar. So he lifted this dirt in Rishis HaRabim, he did Akir Rishis HaRabim, and the hanocha in this pit, in this bar, which at this point in time has a proper dimension of Rishis HaYachid, 10 tfachim deep. But during the placement of this earth, he actually negated the status of the bar, because umiyata, he mitigated the depth of the bar. He annulled the status of the bar because it's no longer 10 tfachim deep. So what's going to be halach in this case? Ma'u hanoch as chayfetz v'silk mechitza, placing down of the chayfetz, and removal, negation of the mechitza status, bahadiyadodikas, are happening simultaneously. Mechayiv, he should be chayiv because even though it's happening at the same time, perhaps we should view it as though they're happening in succession, one after the other. We view it as a hanacha, and the hanacha takes place in a Rosh Hashanah, and only afterwards that the Rosh Hashanah loses its status through the earth which stands within it. Or loy b'chayiv, he shouldn't be chayiv because since the hanacha, the actual placing of the earth, negates the Rosh Hashanah, the Rosh Hashanah is despairing. There's no hanacha in Rosh Hashanah. Let's see Rashi again inside, which is the next Rashi than the one we just saw, which is actually 24 lines from the bottom, beginning with the words Vesilik Mechitza. Says Rashi, Vesilik Mechitza Bahanocha Zu Nistalka Mechitza Zabar. Through the placement of this earth in the bar, the Mechitza Zabar disappears. Shidismata Masora. It was negated because now it's less than 10 tefachim. It was mitigated from 10 tefachim. Mimahani Hai Miuta. Do we say at this miut, this minimization of the sheer influences and helps l'miftarei, it affects ptur, or perhaps we should say no. The fact is that he began the hanacha in a full-fledged bar, so we view the occurrences as though they happened in succession. First the hanacha and then the negation of the mechitza status. So we have two different shilas regarding an events which take place simultaneously. So the first case was a akira, which took place simultaneous with the formation of a mechitza, and we have a reverse case where the hanacha took place simultaneous with removal of the mechitza status. Says the Gemara, what's the question here? That the hanacha negates the status of the mechitza. What was the Rechan's shaila? Why can't he simply clarify the halacha from a halacha that Rabbi Yochanan himself stated elsewhere, from a saying interpretation of Rabbi Yochanan actually on a mission elsewhere? We can derive from there the halacha in our case. This is not as we learned in the mission. If one takes an object and throws it, he's standing with Shesarabim, and he throws it against the wall, which is situated exactly at a distance of 4 amas from where he's standing. If the object hits the wall above 10 tefachim, above the 10 tefachim mark, kezarik ba'aver, as though he threw it in the air, that's no longer considered to be Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah only extends up until tefachim from the ground. Lamata masar, but if it lands on the wall below the 10 tefach mark, kezarik ba'aretz, it is regarded as though he threw it on the ground, and it's chayiv. V'azarik ba'aretz, arba amas chayiv. If one throws an object 4 amas, at a distance of 4 amas, in Rosh Hashanah, he throws it on the floor of Rosh Hashanah, 4 amas, he's chayiv. So that's the Mishnah. V'avinabon, we asked the kash on the Mishnah. The object never landed. He threw it against the wall, it bounced off the wall, never landed. There was no hanacha. It was akira, but there was no hanacha, so why is he chayiv? We're speaking about a plum fig which got stuck to the wall. So certainly there was a hanacha on the side of the wall, which was situated 4 amas away. Says the Gemara, let's try and analyze this story here. Why is he chayiv? He takes an item, he takes his dveila shmeina, throws it against the wall. Now the wall is exactly 4 amas away. Now the Rabban explains that although the dveila didn't really pass 4 amas because it got stuck on the wall, which was exactly 4 amas away. So he's standing here. The wall is exactly 4 amas away from him. The dveila shmeina got attached on the wall, so the dveila shmeina never really traveled a full 4 amas. He's still chayiv. Explains the Ramban why. Because the wall itself is 4 amas away. Something on the wall is considered to be 4 amas away as well, because it's on a wall which is situated 4 amas away. So we understand the Mishnah. Fine. Says the Ramban, we have another problem here. Because this dveila shmeina, this fig, when it gets stuck on this wall, it actually thickens the wall itself. We regard the dveila as though it's part of the wall. So the wall is actually ending right here. if the Dveil Shemem is part of the wall, so it itself is regarded as part of the wall. So it didn't land on a wall which is farthest away. It itself should be regarded as part of the wall, as part of the thickness of the wall. It increases the thickness of the wall. And therefore, he never threw something 4 amas away because this is part of the wall, so to speak. And it's within 4 amas. Says the Gemara, Ve'amai, why is he chayiv? Both things are happening simultaneously. When he throws the object 4 amas away, it lands on the wall, he's actually affecting the dimension of the wall as well. So simultaneous with the hanacha of the dveil on the wall, the dimension of the wall itself is changing, it's thickening. The dveil is becoming part of the wall. And this results in the fact that the dveil never really traveled 4 amas, because it ended right here. This is the wall. This is, so to speak, part of the wall. Let's see inside. Va'amai, hakamim mait ma'arba amis. The fact that the dveil lands on the wall, that itself is memayit the 4 amas. So apparently we see that's not a concern since it's happening simultaneously. The anocha and the miyut of the 4 amas is happening at the same time. Apparently we're not concerned with that. We view them as successive occurrences, as though they happen in succession. First comes the anocha against the wall. As the Ramban explains, since the wall is situated outside 4 amas, we regard the dveil which lands on this wall as though it did the hanocha outside of 4 amas. Now, although the hanocha itself is actually affecting the dimension of the wall, it's thickening the wall, it doesn't concern us. So apparently, things that happen simultaneously don't concern us. So why can't Rabbi Yochanan bring a right from this case? Rabbi Yochanan himself interpreted the Mishnah, explained, speaking about this plum fig which landed on the side of the wall. Apparently, Rabbi Yochanan holds that the Mishnah is teaching us that things that happen simultaneously is no concern. So Rabbi Yochanan's case as well, when the hanocha of the dirt into the bur negates the mechitza status of the bur, he should be chayiv as well, even though it's happening simultaneously. He should be chayiv as a result of the hanocha, due to the hanocha inside that bur. Says the Gemara, you know why you can't bring a raya from that case, from the fig? In the case of the fig, he's not being mevatel the fig to the wall. He's not abandoning the fig to the wall. So in which case the wall doesn't really thicken. It's not part of the wall. It's not viewed as part of the thickness of the wall itself. There's a wall which is out of 4 amas. And there's the fig which is noch on that wall outside 4 amas. As the Rabban explained, there was a hanocha outside 4 amas because the wall is out of 4 amas. The wall is at a distance of 4 amas from the person throwing it. The item which lands flush on this wall is regarded as though it landed outside 4 amas because it's sitting on a wall which is outside 4 amas. This fig is not part of the wall. He was never mevatel to the wall. The wall never came closer through the fig. There's the wall and there's the fig. And the fig is landing on a wall outside 4 amas. However, in our case, with the dirt thrown into this bar, he's mevatel the dirt to the bar. He's negating it. He's nullifying it. He's abandoning the dirt to the bar. And by doing so, he's actually changing the dimension of the bar. The bar originally had 10 tefachim, but now no longer. It's merely 9 tefachim deep. So it's losing its rishayachet status. So now we have a question. Since the hanocha of the earth in the bar and the negation of the din rishayachet of the bar happen at the same time, simultaneously, do we say it's chayiv or it's pater? So once again, the kasha was, why can't we get right from the case of the fig thrown against the wall, which is situated exactly at a distance of 4 amas from the person? Now the fig landing on the wall is regarded as having landed outside 4 amas because it's landing on a wall which is outside 4 amas, but the fig itself is bringing the wall closer because it's increasing the thickness of the wall. So the wall is no longer situated 4 amas at a distance of 4 amas from the person. It's closer than 4 amas. Says the Gemara, in that case, he wasn't mevatel the fig to the wall. The wall remained wall, the fig remained fig. So the wall is still outside 4 amas, and therefore is chayiv. Boy Rav asked the question, Zorak Daf, what if a person throws a board? V'nochal gabi say this, and it landed on top of pegs, and these pegs were 10 tefachim high. He takes his board, which has a surface of 4 tefachim long, 4 tefachim wide, and he throws it onto these pegs, which result in the creation of Rosh Hashanah. On top of this board will not be considered Rosh Hashanah because it's 10 tefachim high, held up by these pegs, and has a surface of 4x4. Is he chayiv for throwing this board? He's doing a hanocha and a creation of Rosh Hashanah simultaneously. So he's standing Rosh Hashanah, throwing this board on the pegs. He's creating Rosh Hashanah by doing so. There's a hanocha and a creation of Rosh Hashanah at the same time. Do we regard this as a hanocha in Rosh Hashanah or not? Since there was no Rosh Hashanah beforehand, it happened at the same time, simultaneously. Says the Gemara once again, Boy Rav asked the question. Zorak Daf, he threw a board, v'nochal gabi sedis, and threw it onto, it landed on top of these pegs. Ma, what is Allah? Says the Gemara, Mike me boili. What's the question here? Hanochas chayfetz, v'asiyas mechitza, ba'de adadi ka'asu? Are we discussing another form, another version of a landing of a chayfetz and a creation of a mechitza that are happening simultaneously? Hanochas chayfetz, landing of an object, v'asiyas mechitza, and a creation of a partition, ba'de adadi ka'asu, which are happening simultaneously? This is very similar to Rabbi Yechan's question of the hanocha in the bar, which is affecting the dimension of the bar. So why does Rav need to ask a new question here? This seems to be a repetition of Rabbi Yechan's question. It says the Gemara, Rav's question was a bit different. Going to Zorak Daf. We're speaking about he threw a board. V'chefetz al gabav. There was an object sitting on top of this board. He threw the chayfetz with the board on top of the pegs. What is the halacha here? Meaning, let's assume for a moment that things that happen simultaneously are not reckoned with. So the board certainly does not carry liability. Why? Because the board is landing and creating a shtiach at the same time. So there's no chiyuv for the board. Let's take on that side of the equation. The question here is a bit different, because this board is supporting a chayfetz above it. So two things are flying together, the board and the chayfetz above it. Should we say like this? Kivon de bahadi adodi ka'asu. Since the two things are happening together at the same time, what are the two things that are happening at the same time? The board and the chayfetz above it are arriving together. Therefore, he's pater kanachas chayfetz v'asiyas mechitza dami. It is regarded like landing of an object and creation of mechitza simultaneously, and he's pater. Or perhaps we should say, kivan delay efsher, delay midla purta. It's impossible that the chayfetz above it hasn't bumped a bit upward, hasn't been lifted a drop when the board lands. So the vibration will cause the chayfetz above it to lift off a bit, to bump up a bit, and land again. So that second landing is another hanacha taking place. So again, kivan delay efsher loy midla purta. It's impossible that the chayfetz didn't lift a bit, and then landed. So perhaps he's chayiv. Why? Kasiyas mechitza. We should view it as though a mechitza was formed, va'anochas chayfetz dami, and afterwards, only afterwards, did the chayfetz land. So do we say in this case that it's chayiv? So once again, the board certainly doesn't carry liability. What about the chayfetz above it, which landed twice? The first time it landed with the board together. Perhaps for that he's pater because it happened simultaneous with the creation of the Rosh Hashanah, which was created when the board landed on those pegs. Let's assume he's pater for that. But then there was another hanacha, because the chayfetz lifted off a bit, it bumped up and came back down. Now there was already a mechitza prepared for it. There was a Rosh Hashanah there. It landed on a full-fledged Rosh Hashanah. Do we say it's chayiv? Or perhaps not. Now the Gemara doesn't explain why he should not be chayiv. So the Farshim explained that the second hanacha was not a separate entity. It happened as a result of the first hanacha. There was a landing, a crash landing, and then it lifted off a bit and landed again. So since it happened as a result of the first hanacha, and we're working with the assumption that the first hanacha does not carry any liability, so perhaps the second hanacha, which comes as a result of the first one, cannot be reckoned with separately, cannot be viewed as a independent hanacha. It's merely a completion of the first hanacha, and therefore it's part. The Gemara concludes, Teiku, we leave it unresolved. Let's take a look at Rashi inside here, which is 7 lines from the bottom. So once again, he took the board with the chayfetz on top of it, threw it onto these pegs. The Gemara says the board perhaps will not carry any liability, but the chayfetz above it, says Rashi, delay efsher delay midli ha chayfetz mi'al daf. It's impossible that the chayfetz was not lifted a bit off the of the board, b'shas hanochas hadaf, when the daf landed, v'hadanayich, and then landed again? Should we say ka'asiyas mechitza bereisha? It is viewed as though the mechitza was formed first, v'hadanachas chayvetz dami, and then afterwards there was the hanach of the chayvetz. V'chayev, the b'shas hanachase, because during that second hanacha kvar nasa daf Rosh Hashanah, the daf, the board, was already formed into Rosh Hashanah. That's one side of the equation. The other side is no, we can't reckon with the second hanacha. It's merely a conclusion of the first hanacha. Therefore, since we're working with the assumption that the first hanacha does not carry any chiyuv, the second hanacha as well will not result in any liability. So in summary, we had a discussion initially regarding a question of throwing an item from Rosh Hashanah over to the stone, which is elevated 10 tefachim off the ground, but it had to pass through an airspace of Makim Ptur, meaning beyond the 10 tefachim mark of Rosh Hashanah, which is an exempt area. So do we say, well, the Akira was Rosh Hashanah, the Hanacha was Rosh Hashanah, it's Chayiv, or do we say, well, it was transferred through a Makim Ptur and it's Pata? We have a Machlekes. Gemara told us that a wall, which is 10 tefachim high, but for instance only 3 tefachim wide on top, which is enclosing an unfenced area, it is mukav l'karmas and creating a Rosh Hashanah by doing so. We regard the top of the kaisel to be a Rosh Hashanah as well, because if he forms a Rosh Hashanah in the contained area within it, certainly he as well should be regarded as Rosh Hashanah. The Gemara concluded 3 shilas of things that happen simultaneously. The first one was Akiras Chayfetz Vasis Mechitza. For instance, if we have a bar which is 9 tefachim deep, he lifts a level of dirt, Akar Chulya. So he did the Akira from a bar which is not Rosh Hashanah, but by doing the Akira, he creates a Rosh Hashanah. Do we say that he's Chayiv? The next question was Hanochas Chayfetz Vesilg Mechitza. If by placing the Chayfetz, he actually nullifies the Mechitza. For instance, we had a bar which is 10 tefachim deep, which is Rosh Hashanah. But by placing that chuli, that level of earth, a layer of earth, he is actually negating the mechitza status of the bar, because he is reducing the depth of the bar into merely 9. Do we say that, well, the hanacha took place in the Rosh Hashanah, or do we say no, since the actual hanacha is negating the Rosh Hashanah, he's pater? In a case where a person has a board and a chayfetz on top of it, he throws it onto these pegs, thereby creating Rosh Hashanah. Now the chayfetz took a bump and landed again. Do we say, well, now it landed on a prepared Rosh Hashanah? Or do we say, no, since this bump was merely as a result of the early hanacha, which took place simultaneous with the creation of Rosh Hashanah, he's pater? And the Gemara concludes, Teku unresolved. Okay, time for a brief review of today's daf. The Gemara began by describing for us those 2 layers of coverings above the Mishkan. We have the lower layer, which consisted of multicolored materials, and we have the upper covering, which consisted of Urias Izim, goat's hair, which actually required a greater measure of expertise and chachma, since the goat's hair was washed and spun on the goats themselves. The Gemara proceeded with the concept of a derech Rosh Hashanah needing to be at least 16 amas wide. This is learned from the Mishkan, where the thoroughfare actually had this width, because those 2 wagons which were loaded up with the krushim and traveling side by side, each agala was 5 amas wide, and there was an additional 5 amas space between those 2 wagons, for a total of 15, and the 1 final amma also needed for the Levi to go slip in on the sides and straighten out, adjust those krushim. This gives us a total of 16 amas. We have the Mishnah, which gives us an introduction to the halacha of Rosh Hashanah. The concept here being that if we have an area which is 10 tefachim, either 10 tefachim high or 10 tefachim deep, it's considered to be a Rosh Hashanah, provided the surface there is 4 tefachim, meaning 4 tefachim at length and 4 tefachim at width. So if it's 10 with a surface of 4 by 4, it is a Rosh Hashanah. We have 3 different examples: either 10 tefachim deep, like a bar; 10 tefachim high, like a surface, the top surface of a cell of a rock; or the Gemara told us even we can combine height and depth together, as in the case of the bar and the chuli surrounding which are mistarif to the share of asar tefachim. The Gemara proceeded was a question in the case where a person will throw an object from Rosh Hashanah over onto the Sela, which is 10 tefachim high, which is Rosh Hashanah, but the item passed through the Aver Makom Ptur because it was beyond the 10 tefachim of Rosh Hashanah, is a Chayiv Apata by Machlokes. We have a case of a wall which is 10 tefachim high, but for instance only 3 tefachim up at the surface. It only has a width of 3 tefachim. But this kaisel is actually forming Rosh Hashanah. The Gemara tells us, just as it forms Rosh Hashanah, certainly it itself is regarded as Rosh Hashanah, therefore the area on top of it is considered Rosh Hashanah. The Gemara concluded with 3 examples of things happening simultaneously, and the Gemara leaves it unresolved.